So we kick off now, and we're very excited about our discussion today. And I'd particularly like to welcome Professor Jane Stout, VP for Biodiversity and Climate Action at Trinity, and a prominent voice for biodiversity and its value. So you're very welcome, Professor. I'd also like to introduce Professor Iris Muller, Head of Geography at Trinity College Dublin, and with a particular interest in coastal environments. And you're very, very welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening. Dr. Dan Rogers is next up on our panel here. He's the Head of Education here at Tangent, Trinity's Ideas Workspace. He has a background in psychology and education, with a particular interest in how innovation and entrepreneurship can address societal challenges. So it's great that you're here today too, Dan. Thank you for making the time. And our final panelist this evening and chair is the European Accelerator Manager, our European Accelerator Manager, Brandon Goss. Sorry, Brandon, just to get your name in. And he has a particular focus on climate and health in the accelerator programs here at Trinity College. He's chairing tonight's session, so I'll hand you over to Brandon now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anya. Is this working okay, folks? Can you hear me okay? Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Brandon Goss, as the name suggests. And you're very welcome. Thanks for joining us, folks, both here in person and online remotely, as you're stewing in your back gardens, no doubt, in 26 degrees heat. It's always like that, so that's not really a climate emergency. It's always like that this time of the year in Ireland. But we're delighted to invite you in tonight to discuss, a huge subject, a subject that possibly intimidates an awful lot of people in terms of people's ability to affect change. So climate innovation and climate action in particular, how do we get involved? How do we make a change that makes an impact? Does our individual behavior count, or is it somebody else's problem? So we'll try and open that discussion up tonight with our august panel this evening. And I'll kick off with my first question for Dr. Muller. Iris, just in terms of the opportunities, as we said, there's a huge sense of powerlessness amongst people, individuals, if you like, in the face of the catastrophic changes that we're seeing before us and listening to on a daily basis at this juncture. But are there opportunities out there for people to actually do something and affect change at a systemic level?
Yeah, it is a bit sort of depressing, isn't it, living through these times, and we're seeing climate change play out in front of our eyes. We've seen the hot heat waves passing Europe several times this summer already. We're going to see more of that in the winter. I'm a coastal geomorphologist and really worried about flooding and big storms in the winter time, and it's the first time actually in my life I've found it quite depressing. But I think what we can all do is just look back on ourselves and into our own lives and what motivates us to do what we are doing, and to see where in there are small things where we can perhaps change something. It's easier than ever before to educate ourselves about individual topics. So if there's, say, you're really passionate about recycling and not wasting, I'm really passionate about not wasting food, for example. And so you might have an issue like that, and you might then think, okay, well, what is the story behind that? How much difference would this make? What action that I could take, or that those around me could take, could make the most difference? And you start from that perspective and you educate yourself. Now, with educating yourself, I think one of the issues is to make sure that you sort of quality check the information that you get, but it's easier than ever before for us to acquire information via the internet. We live in this digital age, we've just been through COVID and have seen the advantages of that, also the disadvantages, but I think we can use that. That's a real opportunity to get information that we need in order to become powerful and act. And the second thing is, I think, is then act. Act along the lines of what you've found out from the information that you've got. Get some people around you to help you act in that way. Maybe there's others in the community who feel similarly passionate about that individual small thing. And then you take that forward with them. And the third thing, I think, is tell people about it, because this is something where we all feel really powerless in the face of political decisions that we can only ever influence once every 4 years, or whenever the elections come up, and then not even everyone can vote. But we need to look at what we can do individually and start there and tell people what we're doing, so that the word spreads and that the incentives to do something grow, that the electorate kind of grows into an electorate that will then vote a particular way, and then political change might follow. So I think that's where the opportunity is. And we also have electronic digital opportunities for actually becoming citizen scientists, for example. There's plenty of citizen science organizations out there that are acquiring information. You can get involved in something like that. And so I think it's accessible to us individually. We just need to start from us as individuals.
And we spoke earlier, Jane, about how, like, for example, scientists focus on very, what might be perceived as very niche topics and subjects. And that, as a result, because of their specialization, perhaps, maybe their opinion isn't as important as it could be when dealing or addressing a bigger problem that seems to be completely disassociated from that research. But how do you make the research relevant in terms of an academic pursuit when you want to affect change at a more immediate level, if you like?
Yeah, no, and I think that sort of just reflects what's happening in society. As a scientist, you're working away on something quite small and quite specific, and not really knowing whether that's actually going to make a difference and make a change. And that's how individuals in society are feeling. I think as a scientist, having the sort of the big picture there as the backdrop, and progressing your work in that particular space. You can get on with it. People often say to me, do you not get depressed working in the area you work in? And until now, I don't think I have yet. I've got to have quite a lot of optimism. But also, I suppose, what I've started doing is working outside of that little narrow focus of my discipline, and working across disciplines. And I think this is one of the things that's really challenging. We all talk quite different languages. You don't know the people so well, and it's just, you don't have that sort of disciplinary background, and so you have to have the confidence to say, hang on, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand that. What's that acronym? What do you mean? And so building up personal relationships, and getting outside of your comfort zone is really important as a scientist. And I think that we can give that to as a lesson to learn as well, is that people don't really know, and Iris is saying we need to become more educated, and don't be afraid to ask the questions, so I think not being afraid.
And is it then the responsibility of educators, Dan, to shed a light on that and offer people the pathways or the alternative ways of empowering themselves, if you like?
Yes, I think in part it is. I think it's such a complex, multifaceted problem that's multidimensional. It really requires, as Jane said, a multidisciplinary sort of approach, and we'll see solutions, I think, that will come, that'll be cross-sectoral. So we need people who are comfortable working in that kind of environment, that are comfortable with, I suppose, some degree of ambiguity, with a problem like climate change, which is non-linear, which the consequences, and I must say, actually, I'm not a climate scientist, but I do know a little bit about human motivation and behavior. And even though we are aware of the consequences, the negative consequences of climate change, we're aware of their proximity to us, this isn't enough of a motivation necessarily for us to change. So I think as educators, we need to look closely at what motivates both individual and organizational change to affect climate change in a positive way. So I think sowing those seeds happens in education, absolutely. And I think there is a dawn of sort of climate entrepreneurs on the horizon because of the interest in funding now behind this activity, where people can use their skills in a very meaningful and purposeful way to address climate change, be they engineers, be they anthropologists, be they psychologists. They can find a way to work together and find a common language to solve what is a very complex problem.
Yeah. So I think rather than exclusively consider what young undergraduates might be able to do at the moment, or young people in society generally, but there is an opportunity to upskill people in the workforce as well, isn't there? To bring people out of the corporate environment, bring them back into a space where they can feel that they can unlearn a lot of the really negative stuff that they've been deploying as commercial strategies for so long, and relearn a way of actually solving the problems that they've contributed to creating in the first place, perhaps. In a guilt-free type of environment, of course, and Tangent does that, doesn't it? Tangent offers that type of upskilling opportunity for people.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tangent is the home of innovation entrepreneurship at Trinity. It's the front door for anybody who has an idea that they want to convert into some kind of impact. And specifically, we do a program in climate entrepreneurship at postgraduate level that looks at systems thinking, systems innovation, climate adaptation and mitigation, but also enterprise development. So how do you go about actually the nuts and bolts of starting a viable venture that is going to have a positive impact in terms of climate? So I think one of the ways, and we'll probably come on to this, sometimes people are unsure where to start because it's such an overwhelming topic. There's so much information out there, and there can be some conflicting information out there as well. So you need to look for the reliable information and the science. So I think some guidance then in terms of a place to start. I think somewhere like Tangent, which is a multidisciplinary space, which is looking at climate purely from an entrepreneurial angle, and how can we go about developing ventures that will have that kind of impact. I think that's a great place to start. And then there's a journey to be taken from there in terms of, we'll talk about that journey maybe in a bit, but it can be a great place to start.
Yeah. Just in terms of, we're talking about the need for systemic change, not just isolated silo change, which will be pretty useless in and of itself. So from a biodiversity perspective, Jane, how important is it for people to acknowledge the importance, not just of carbon control or reducing carbon emissions, but actually, regenerating the earth in a productive and sustainable way that ultimately will help offset, even before offsetting becomes an issue?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm really glad you asked that, because I was dying to jump in there. When we talk about, and this is something I've realized relatively recently, when as a scientist, when I talk about climate, I mean something very specific to do with global climatic systems, atmosphere and weather and that kind of stuff, which obviously isn't my expertise, which is why I'm probably describing it badly. But to me, that doesn't encompass all of the problems. But a lot of people, when they talk about climate, and I think when you say climate, you mean all of the environmental problems, things like pollution, things like biodiversity loss. And so on the one hand, that is again, it's one of these language things. What do we mean when we say climate? Well, actually, we mean all this stuff. Oh, okay, right, okay, now I get you. Or do we just mean a very specific system? But to come back to your question, in terms of addressing climate change, obviously, reducing carbon emissions, but it's not just about reducing emissions. And often we get tied up in this obsession with carbon and net zero or absolute zero and reducing emissions. There's a lot more to it than that. There's already climate change that has started that we will need to adapt to. So there's things already happening that will continue to happen. And Iris can probably tell you about sea level rise and effects on coasts. But there's also, there's so many other things going on as well. And in terms of our biodiversity and our living natural world, it's in a terrible state, but it has the potential to recover, and it has the potential to help us in adapting and mitigating to climate change, but also have lots of other benefits. So just in terms of sort of biodiversity and how natural ecosystems can help us to tackle climate, if we think about bogs, peat bogs in Ireland, they actually store over half of all the soil, peatlands store half of all the soil carbon in Ireland in about 16% of the land area. So our peatlands are really, really important. So we need to restore those peatlands and get those systems working again for carbon, for water, for holding, they're like giant sponges, they hold the water so that you don't get these flooding events, and for biodiversity, because there's creatures that only live in these kind of habitats. So we need to learn from nature and work with nature and restore nature so that we can tackle the climate challenge, so that we can tackle other challenges, including our own health and well-being, and because it underpins our economy as well. So I think, we need to think about this broadly, and I think there are win-wins. Yeah. We just need win-win-wins, but we need to identify and work on those.
The segue you introduced there preliminary to yours was perfect, just in terms of the need to adapt and effectively face up and confront the fact that we're already in serious trouble, for want of a better word. And how do we adapt to it? And what do we do, or what can we do? And therefore, like, are there opportunities there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been thinking about that a lot over the past few years, because we've kind of, in the coastal space where I work, it's been all about restoring particular ecosystems for individual species. So we might have observed an individual migratory bird, being close to extinction, and then it's all about conserving the habitat for that particular individual bird. And then in recent years, we've kind of become aware of the fact that actually, well, that requires us to actually conserve the whole ecosystem, or restore the ecosystem, because it depends on that ecosystem. Then we realize that the ecosystems do things for us. They store carbon. In my case, coastal ecosystems also protect us from tsunamis, storms, big high energy winter events that might otherwise flood people's houses and damage infrastructure that lies behind them. And now we're kind of turning to the ecosystem saying, okay, well, we could restore them for carbon, or we could restore them to be a coastal protection, or we could restore them for a particular purpose. And we've sort of started to do that, and we've realized that there actually are trade-offs. So you might restore an ecosystem so that it becomes very good at, maintaining high biodiversity, but that might not actually be the best state of that ecosystem to provide you with carbon storage, or to provide you with, many times it is, but to provide you with coastal protection services or whatever. So we've got ourselves into this muddle, thinking, oh my goodness, what do we do now? Because how do we approach this? And then on top of that, in the coastal realm, we're seeing nature actually demonstrate to us how dynamic and complex it is. And I always take my students out to the coast and try and get them to think about the interconnectivity of the whole of the coastline in terms of where nutrients flow and where sediments get redistributed. And it's immensely complex. It's a system with so many different variables. And you mentioned nonlinear climate change. Just think about an open system that's driven from the inside with sort of self-organization that goes on, and driven from the outside with extreme events that force it into different directions and different times, this way and that. And so we're seeing actually areas that we have earmarked for conservation now migrating along the shore out of the boundary that was drawn around them to conserve them. And we don't know how to deal with that. And we don't know how to deal with this dynamism that is shown to us, by the way in which nature works. So I think what we need to do also is move away from this sort of control mindset that we have into one that is more of a, let's watch what nature does and let's adapt what we do to that. So in that space, actually, innovation in the technology side is really important. We've got Earth observation. We have apps on the phone that tell us what the weather is every single day. We can have stuff like that will teach us or tell us how nature is changing in front of our eyes. And sometimes that change is completely natural, and it's up to us to live with it, rather than think about it as a fixed thing that we design, we control. I think we've reached the end of that.
And I think that point about innovation and using technology to help us to track change, to model change, to predict change, to look at trade-offs. And I think that's a really important point, this idea of trade-offs. That's where a lot of the innovation needs to be, because so far, as you say, it's been quite isolated, looking at carbon, or looking at certain species of breeding bird, or looking at individual health. It's bringing all of that together and having the mechanisms and the technology to do that. I think there's huge potential for innovation there.
Yeah. And the biggest challenge then is we're trying to counterbalance all of this with the need for continued economic development and continued economic growth. I suppose we're looking for a balance then with a new type of job potentially emerging, and maybe a new set of qualifications to emerge where that qualified individual can slot in and affect change the way it's required. So, do we need continued government intervention in order to make this happen? Or can we rely on the private sector and enterprise to make it happen because it's a new space and there are potentially interesting commercial opportunities in it? How do you think we achieve that balance?
Yeah,
Dan,
I'd
you
be,
said yeah.
I'd be slow to rely on the private sector alone, private enterprise. I do think obviously political will, government, regulation. I mean, most organizations are motivated by profit. So we do need to look for a way that positive climate impact is profitable for those organizations. I'm not sure exactly how we do that, but we do need to do that. Again, looking at it from an individual sort of, how do individuals adapt in terms of their behavior? I think, so I'm reminded of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, which feels like a very dated film now, but actually was probably quite prophetic at the time. Climate change is highly inconvenient, and the kinds of change that we as individuals need to make are probably things we may not be in a position to do or may not want to do now. So if we need to look at the types of foods that we eat and where they come from, so whether our avocados travel halfway across the world and all of the water that's used to grow them and to transport them, our cars that we drive, our homes that we live in. So we have a complete re-examination of how we live. So to me, and this is an opinion, but there's a very fundamental issue, and maybe this relates to your earlier point. There's a distinct separation between us and our environment, and that's causing that issue. So we see ourselves as distinct and separate from our natural environment, and then as a result, we don't really connect with the negative impacts that we have, and they're not immediate enough. They're not affecting us immediately. We're aware how climate change disproportionately impacts the developing world. We know that's happening right now, but that's not enough for us to do something differently. And that's not to say that the responsibility lies with the individuals. It really, I think, lies with the policymakers. It lies with the regulators, the government. Ultimately.
What's your sense, Jane? I mean,
yeah, no, I agree, but I think we need the policy structure from the top down, but we also need the bottom up. And you talk to the policymakers and they say, well, you know, the politicians, we're not being doorstopped on this issue. So this comes back to what can individuals do? You know, make a fuss about it when the politicians come around, so that they do know that there is some pressure from the bottom up. But also, we're all consumers. So you know, we need to consume less. I suppose that's number one of what can individuals do is consume less and you know, reuse, repair, repurpose more. Individuals can do that, but organizations can do that as well. So I think it's you know, it needs to come top down, but the pressure needs to come bottom up. And I think the corporations then are in the middle, and you know, need to respond to consumer pressure as well as to regulation. So it's kind of carrots and sticks, isn't it? And you know, I think it's down to everyone. Yeah. These corporations, these governments, they're all run by individuals. Yeah. So those individuals can make a difference.
I thought my sense is that there is a paradigm shift now. It's slowly taking place. I mean, it might be almost imperceptible because we're inundated, to borrow an unfortunate expression, by like the endlessly bad news and catastrophic news from all over the globe. But at the same time, my sense is that there's greater shareholder pressure now on corporates to affect change, and that kind of ground up pressure is being felt. Consumers are more interested in alternatives in food supply and so on and so forth, and equally in sustainable clothing. You know, one of the companies that was previously a participant in a climate accelerator of ours in recent years, in Tangent, has just raised another €1.5 million. Thriftify, they're called, a sustainable charity clothing online offering, which is great. So that's a real credible kind of vote of confidence in a new model, new business model, if you like, in the sustainable clothing space. I just put it out to the audience just for a quick reaction. I mean, as individuals, what's your sense at the moment when you're listening to the news? Do you feel powerless? Do you feel anxious? Or do you feel like there's a real opportunity to do something now, that you're empowered to do something? Anybody can say anything if they like. You've no interest in the news whatsoever, have you? What's going on? I think when you look at the news, industry like agriculture, like seems very far away from. I mean, it's like putting the juice in the process.
reducing the amount of milk I put my porridge in there, amount of beef that I eat.
Mm.
So I suppose, but it seems, I'm not sure it's still working out. It seems that as an individual you can make those changes, but it seems really, really, really challenging in society. This is essentially that's what the agriculture guy said, which obviously is very concerning for them. Talk to them about, very efficiently here.
Yeah.
So a lot of it just seems, that talk about small changes, but not a lot of time.
No, we're passing the buck a lot as
Yeah.
individuals, I believe.
So it just seems, it all seems kind of.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of that seed change, as you say, is happening, but as you say, it's very slow, and maybe it's too slow. I don't
So what I would say, sorry, is that perhaps it's not that individuals need to be forced in some way to make that change quicker.
Yeah.
And this is what we were talking about earlier with respect to COVID. We've seen that individuals can be forced to do something if the government thinks it's important and in the common interest to do so.
But the difference with COVID was we were told it would end. The difference is this isn't going to end. So I think that's psychologically that's hard, right?
Yeah, I guess the goalpost shifted with COVID as well. It lasted longer than we expected it to, but there was immediate action, and there was money found, there was research that happened, there was vaccines, all in a very short space of time. There is a sense that this doesn't feel as immediate as something like that, and as a result, that sort of resource hasn't been put behind it.
But is it a question of us, acknowledging the truth here, which we were discussing earlier as well, that effectively we're right in the middle. Well, it's only starting, actually. So it's not going to change for potentially hundreds of years. The damage that has been done already to the earth, climate change, the damage to biodiversity, it's done. And it's going to take a long, long time to repair. But what can we do about it? Number one is, once we move from the denial stage, perhaps, then we can start adapting and confronting it, but obviously consider solutions then. And where do we get those solutions from? And there are, let's bring it back to Tangent for a sec, Dan. There are opportunities here for people who are looking for some form of empowerment and who might be able to choose a pathway or find a pathway to do something.
Absolutely. And I think in the context of, you asked the question, do people feel anxious? I think it's something that we do hear in relation to climate change is anxiety and that feeling of being overwhelmed. And I think sometimes people need a place to start. And a good place to start is actually to educate yourself, to better understand the problem. And if you can better understand the problem, you're maybe more in a position then to understand how you can be part of the solution, and how, what sort of skills you have, how can your skills complement others, and vice versa, and how can we work within the context. I suppose here in Tangent, we have an entrepreneurial focus, so we're particularly interested in how we can develop an entrepreneurial mindset to this kind of problem, and put behind that, a strong educational focus through our PG Cert in climate entrepreneurship, but then also, focus on mentoring, focus on progression pathways. So if you have potential startup, that you can join one of our accelerator programs, potentially get investment. So it's not just about the idea, it's actually about driving the idea forward, turning that idea into value and impact ultimately. And I think this is somewhere that you can do that.
If I may.
Oh yeah, go ahead, absolutely.
Our young son, he's only 17, came up with a devastatingly simple idea. We should listen to the teenagers a little bit more, I think, because all you need to do is, whatever cause it is you want championing to make a difference, get media influences to champion that cause. And you're going to touch thousands, not just influence from your own backyard. You'll be touching worldwide thousands and thousands of people if you get the right person to champion your cause. It's such an easy way to get your small idea out there.
Yeah. I mean, Greta Thunberg is a perfect example of that. And then the corollary there, though, is you get the counter narrative being produced by people who resent change and who are very powerful at managing the incumbents and preventing change from happening. But you're dead right, particularly with a cohort that's open to influence.
Yeah.
influencers at that age and that those profiles are critical.
I think we were discussing earlier just about how front and center the sciences and maybe the arts and humanities maybe aren't as present and visible, and actually that can be a very evocative way to get people to consider this and the impacts of it through the arts.
But within Trinity then, beyond Tangent, Jane, as the Vice President for Biodiversity and Climate Action, what kind of pathways are becoming visible or are opening up?
Yeah, I
from
mean,
your
this
perspective?
is one of the first things we're doing is trying to have a look at, okay, what we're already doing across Trinity. And I've been an academic in Trinity for a long time, but there's so much going on that I didn't know about. And so it is being, this education is happening across the disciplines to different extents. Obviously, Iris and I are in the School of Natural Sciences. That's where, almost everything we do is around these topics. But it is coming into more and more modules in more and more disciplines, which I think is really, really important. It's not in all of them. So I think, what I'd like to see is that our students all have an opportunity for some kind of basic, and I say basic, not too basic, because then you lose all the nuance and the complexity, which is part of the problem. But some foundational maybe knowledge about the topic that they can then bring into their disciplines. We're going to need lawyers and politicians and social workers and health workers and as much as we're going to need climate scientists and geographers, we're going to need it across all of these disciplines, and understanding of the world that our students are going out to. So I think embedding it in our undergraduate curriculum, we've got lots of postgraduate opportunities, and again, things I didn't know about until we started to look into it, and different options through master's courses, through postgrad certificates, through continuous professional development, through lifelong learning, and there's a lot of our staff and our students that are involved in working with local schools, working with local communities, all the way through to working with businesses and corporations, all the way through to working with University of the Third Age, the retirees, so it's that lifelong learning.
Yeah.
I think we're doing it. We're maybe not doing it enough yet, but we're not connecting on it.
Sure.
And that's something I think, this, as I say, this cross-disciplinary work and conversations is difficult. But that's what we need to do. We need to step out of our comfort zones. We need to connect, and we need to make sure that there are opportunities for everybody to get this foundational knowledge to build on in their own discipline. So we talk about a breadth of knowledge and a depth of knowledge. So making sure that we've got people with the depth of knowledge in the different disciplines, not everybody with the same breadth of knowledge, but getting both breadth and depth.
Yeah. And Iris, does that mean, for example, geography has to take on maybe a slightly more commercial dimension?
I think in a way it already is doing that, or it's starting to do that, but on individual kind of topic basis. But I think the important thing there that I would add to that is that it is difficult to bring these disciplines together. And I would also say that, and this is something that I've been thinking about again for a lot now in my role as head of Department of Geography, is that it is actually quite difficult to teach interdisciplinarily across different cohorts of students. And in geography, for example, we take students who come through the sciences, and we take students who come through the arts and humanities into our modules. And we have modules on climate change and explaining the climate system, explaining exactly how it works, explaining why the climate has shifted over the last millennia and then into the current post-industrial age. And it takes a particular individual to be able to explain that to a sociology student or a history student, and get them to understand the science, the actual science, but without having to be equipped with all of the equations and statistical knowledge or whatever, the kind of hardcore, scientific tools that are being used to teach science at school. And I'm a great believer, and I know it's possible because I've seen students come out of that and they know how the climate system works. They're not scientists, they're history students, but they know how it works. They know why it fluctuates. They know where the uncertainties lie. And they go out there, and I think, I take great pride in thinking that those students might become politicians one day, and they have that knowledge. But I couldn't just sort of get someone in from a physics department and teach those students climate science. it wouldn't work. In fact, that has been tried in some organisations I've been a part of, and you know, was a great disaster. So it is how the education happens, as well as the difficulty.
And embracing that complexity. And I think we're so used to trying to simplify everything, and you know, the social media sound bites that gets rid of complexity. But this is really complex, and we need to understand. We need to embrace complexity and not try to simplify it, and understand it's complicated and there's trade-offs, and it's not linear. There's not one answer at the end. I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
And as luck would have it, not entirely coincidental, Tangent is currently recruiting for a postgraduate certificate.
Yeah, that's correct. And I'll talk about that in just a moment, but I just wanted to follow up on the points made there. Is I think one of the reasons, I suppose, climate entrepreneurship works as a subject in Tangent particularly well is that innovation entrepreneurship sort of transcends discipline. So it allows us to create a space where disciplines can come together, particularly at the postgraduate level, where people, I suppose, have got their undergraduate degree. They're maybe more open to exploring topics like innovation and what that means within their discipline, but also what it means across disciplines, and then giving it a specific thematic lens, in this case climate entrepreneurship. So yes, we are recruiting for a postgraduate certificate, which is kicking off in September. We have a number of places left on that program, so it's closing actually next week. So anybody who is interested in applying for the postgraduate certificate, it's a 30 credit PG cert at level 9. It's a hybrid, it's a blended program with hybrid classes as well as in person, and a small number of in person and a good number of online classes. So a good deal of flexibility in terms of how it's delivered. And as I mentioned earlier, specific focus on systems innovation with respect to climate adaptation and mitigation and enterprise development. So welcome applications for that.
Yeah, and it's open to people who are in employment or people who are between jobs. If you're between jobs, it's free.
Very important point. Fully funded for those not in employment. And for those in employment, 10% of the fee, which amounts to
375 euro. Yeah, cheap as chips. For a 30 credit level 9 qualification, that will open up other interesting pathways.
And a good demonstration that the government is, sponsoring these kinds of programs, encouraging to see that and to see that they want people to upskill in this area. Yeah.
Great. Well, listen, before we conclude, because we're about to conclude, I just wanted to see if anybody here in person had any questions that they'd like to put to the panel. Controversial? Not controversial? Doesn't really matter? No?
One question.
One online question. My God.
Business and economics have a kind of model that acknowledges planetary.
None of the schools are represented here.
They're not.
You
No.
couldn't possibly say.
That's the only question.
Well,
Sorry,
I
that
would say
wasn't on.
that they do often shoot for the stars. I don't know if that necessarily answers the question.
Do Springboard students enjoy full access to Trinity facilities, example, library, etc.? And the answer to that is yes. Once you're registered with Trinity College, you are registered in the same way as every other student here, with access to all the library and workshops and seminars and lots of other good things.
Drum roll. Next question.
No
Any
other
questions here?
questions
Any
for the
live
moment.
questions at all? No. Okay.
I'll round off with a question if you don't mind, which is pretty much just for our panelists. What would your top tip be that we could take away today to help us make an impact in our own way?
Go on, Jane.
Do you want me to start?
Full tips.
I'm going to have to say education. Find out more. It's overwhelming. There's a lot of information out there, but get yourself educated.
I mean, I'm biased, but I think a top tip would be to join the PG Cert to get a grounding in climate entrepreneurship. Would be an excellent place to start feeling like you're having an impact on something as complex as climate change, and to do so in a practical way with a relatively short commitment. That would be my top tip.
And I would say bring the topic more into conversation with anyone and everyone in whatever situation you are with them. Sometimes it's quite difficult. I mean, you know, we had a situation recently with some teenagers, for example, who really had no interest in talking about it. But sometimes if you ask a question to the individuals, it then prompts some kind of response, and then you can carry on with the conversation and you get the conversation started. And the more people talk about the issue and the more people talk about thinking about it and being aware of it, and then they will pick up on certain things, and the information will flow through society, and maybe we will get political change in that way.
I would say inertia is no longer good enough. It's just not acceptable. The world is changing around us, and unless we do anything about it, we're doomed, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, listen. Oh, we have another question. Yes, sir. Two more questions.
Actually, one is a comment on the question that came in online, because I'm actually sitting here from the business school upstairs. I just came down from the 4th floor. And while I'm not involved in the academic and teaching side, I'm very much on the research side, but I know on the academic side, the whole curriculum are being overhauled at the moment. You can see right at the front of the building here, the new strategy, Transforming Business for Good, and sustainability, climate change, biodiversity loss are being recognised, and the whole curricula are being restructured so that this becomes a really important element at postgraduate and undergraduate level. So I know there's a lot happening in that area. I had a more specific question, actually, because the area of research that I actually work with in the business school is actually on nature-based entrepreneurship. So enterprises who are driven by an environmental as opposed to a commercial mission, but with massive potential to scale. But they have different motivations and different pathways to scaling than other types of enterprises. So I'm just wondering, when you mention module 3 there, climate enterprise development, does that take into account the kind of range of enterprises in this space and different, say, scaling routes, like, for example, franchising as opposed to equity investment and so on? Or what's covered under climate enterprise development? Because there's thousands of entrepreneurs already out there in this space that really need help to scale, but they're kind of shying away from traditional routes because traditional routes, as you've already acknowledged, are focused on commercial development, which is not a really good fit with enterprises who are motivated by environmental and societal missions, but still they need financing to scale. So I'm just wondering to what extent, what's covered in that?
Just to go academic on the course, but to my knowledge, they do cover all aspects of business development, be they commercial, be they environmental, social, and the different models behind them, as far as I'm aware. I think also in that context, it's very much at the early stage. So the program is not intended to have people who are coming with businesses onto the program. It's more, how do I set up a business, either through partnership, through limited company, etc. What are the nuts and bolts of doing that? What are the different business models behind that kind of organization?
I would just add, just quickly, separately on that, Tangent and Trinity College are members of the EU, or the Horizon Europe body, EIT Climate Kick. So EIT meaning acronym for European Innovation Technology Institute. So we do a lot of entrepreneurship focused activity with startups in particular and young embryonic companies that are looking to affect change at a systemic level. And we're actually currently running accelerator initiatives, and will be for the next couple of years under their aegis. So if anybody's interested, if you're interested in having a chat separately, we can have a chat about that. I run those accelerator programs.
And there's a nice progression route from the PG cert, from that module that you mentioned there, potentially onto those accelerators with opportunities for funding as well.
So I was wondering, I'm not sure if anyone in the panel was involved in the course last year, but I was wondering if maybe you could tell a little bit of a success story or a case study from someone who's taken the course previous.
Excellent question. I know everybody's going to look at me. And I won't be able to tell it. There's a couple of good success stories. One particularly in food production. and I won't do it justice by telling it, but maybe what I'll do is we'll share it after this. There's a couple of entrepreneurs that have come out of the program successfully, developed startups. A surprising amount of creative people were on the program, so with creative backgrounds that we hadn't anticipated. Just to acknowledge that the program didn't run last year; it ran the year before. So it's run once. So that was the pilot cohort with 42 students, a very diverse group, a lot of creative entrepreneurs, and a couple of startups that came out. Anya might know one of them. I see her edging in there, possibly. But what we might do is share some information, because I'm aware, but I won't give you the full. Yeah. But there has been some success stories.
To build on what Dan said there, whilst the program has run once, this will be the second time the program would run this year coming. The people who do the program come from a very diverse range of backgrounds. So, for example, we have some farmers in the Midlands last year. The farmer particularly inherited, a small holding, and he was very, very keen. One of the things he said to us was, "I've inherited a problem, I want to buy a solution." He joined the program. We've had senior IDA from our management team join the program as well and participate in it, as well as one of the senior people from the Project Arts Centre. So the people who come to the program come from a really diverse backgrounds, and it's really, really interesting to see how they work together, work on their projects to get out of the program what they actually.
Very good. Great. Well, listen, to conclude, I'd like to thank our guests very, very, very much indeed for giving up their time this evening. Thank you for all coming in person, and thanks for everybody online for joining us despite the heat. Follow up, look at the Tangent website for more details. I think August the 16th is the deadline to apply for the postgrad certificate. And by all means, throw your hat into the ring for that, because it's a very rewarding program. And as we discussed, there are numerous pathways then beyond that through which you can follow in order to hopefully individually affect change, and ultimately as a society and globally we can all do something that will impact the kings. So thank you very much indeed.
Yes, and just to build on that, thank you all very much. Thank you to our panel very, very much for making the time to be here today. And if any of you have any questions or queries or brief word you'd like to have on the program, there's a few of us from the team here tonight who would like to have those chats with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Somebody writes to me on stage.